Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think folks are continuing to join here, so we'll probably give folks another minute to join, and then we'll get started. But if you're here already, we're going to request that folks do a similar thing if you've joined previous workshops to find yourself in the find your Zoom square in the meeting. And if you click on the three dots at your square and can go ahead and rename yourself with your organization listed after your name. And if you are a member of the project team, the larger project team, including representative from the EDCs, if you can put parentheses PT in front of your name, that will help us, especially as we move into breakouts. And I will repeat those instructions in just a few minutes as more folks join. Great. So I'm seeing some more folks join. Welcome, everyone. As you're joining, there's a few instructions on the screens here. If you could find yourself in the participant list or your Zoom square and click on the three dots and use the rename function to add your affiliation after your name, that would be great. And if you are a member of the larger project team, could you please add parentheses PT in front of your name, which will help us organize folks in the breakout room. And then we do have a check-in question for today, where today's focus will be on sort of forward-looking into the future. And so we'll be discussing roadmaps and implementation plans. And so we'd love it if folks could share in the chat 1 to 2 words that describe your vision of a Massachusetts energy future in 2035 and 2050. So feel free to go ahead and drop your responses in the chat, and we'll start to see some of those come in. Starting to see some responses to the check-in question: democratic, sustainable, decentralized, clean and equitable, affordable, reliable, renewable, GHG reduction with equity, sustainable, affordable, holistic, high road, affordable again, clean, democratized, sorry, reliable, flexible. Excellent. These are great to see. Clean and affordable. Great. So if you're just joining, welcome. There's a check-in question here on the screen. Feel free to put your response in the chat. And if you can use the rename function to put your affiliation after your name, that would be great. And if you're just joining and are a member of the larger project team, if you could put in parentheses PT in front of your name, that will help us organize folks in the breakout rooms later on in the workshop. Seeing some additional responses to the check-in in the chat: clean, decentralized, equitable. Flexible. Excellent. Okay. I think I'm starting to see the numbers start to slow here a bit, so I think we could probably go ahead and get started. Thanks for responding to that check-in question. And welcome everyone to our fourth and final workshop as part of the grid services study. On the screen is just a disclaimer that's been part of the other all the other workshops, stating that this workshop will be recorded, is being recorded. If you prefer to have yourself not recorded with video or any of your responses, feel free to stay on mute and turn your video off, but we welcome you to still listen in. And I think we can go ahead and move on. So I'm going to start. My name is Brett Webster. I'm with RMI and part of the project team here working with E3 and supporting Mass CEC and the EDCs and other state agencies as part of this grid services study. I'm going to start with just a bit of context and background, and then some teeing up of this workshop here today, and then we'll pass to Mass CEC to give a more in-depth background on the project. The overall objectives for the grid services study are listed here: to develop an initial methodology for calculating location-specific distribution grid services value that distributed energy resources can provide in the Commonwealth, to explore potential compensation frameworks specific to this location-specific value that balance policy objectives and avoid overlap or double counting with other incentives. The third is to integrate equity and environmental justice impacts in both valuation and compensation for grid services. Fourth, to create a roadmap to guide both near and long-term development of grid services for DERs, and to provide opportunities to incorporate stakeholder input, which is one of the thrusts of this workshop series. Next slide, please. So just to recap on the topics that we've covered thus far, in workshop 1 was really geared towards laying a foundation for the role that distributed energy resources can play in offering grid services to the distribution system. So we teed up some motivation. We discussed some about the role of stakeholder engagement throughout this grid services study, and then got some initial feedback from stakeholders on the study goals and approach. In workshop 2, we focused mostly on valuation and did a deep dive on the valuation methods. And then we also sort of introduced compensation structures and got some feedback from stakeholders on considerations for both valuation and compensation, and then also a bit on implementation specifically with regard to reducing barriers to access from an equity standpoint. Our last workshop, workshop 3, was focused on sort of a deep dive on compensation and the individual components that go into compensation. And we had extended breakout rooms of about an hour where we met with many of you all and to get better understand your priorities and preferences for the various options regarding compensation structure. Today in workshop 4, our objectives are to sort of, as I mentioned at the beginning, focus on more of the forward-looking steps, what happens from here. And so our goals are to provide a deeper understanding of the core policy considerations for implementing grid service offerings, to share and receive feedback on a long-term vision for grid services in Massachusetts, to discuss near-term objectives within the next 5 years that will set Massachusetts on a path toward achieving this long-term vision, and allow participants and stakeholders to participate in that process. And the fourth is to communicate expected implementation timeframes and the phases that will happen subsequently as this study concludes by the end of this summer. Our agenda in support of those objectives, we're just sort of wrapping up the welcome and check-in section. We will spend about 15 minutes on a recap of the study and the progress we've made thus far. We'll then pass it to the E3 team to share some information on implementation, inclusive of policy considerations, that long-term vision and near-term objectives. We'll also have some opportunity to hear from the EDCs as an example of what the next steps look like from their end. We'll have a moment for clarifying questions. We'll then do similar if you attended the last workshop, we'll do a poll about the breakout rooms so we can get a sense of where folks' interest lies. And then we'll follow that poll with a short break. We'll return from the break and dive right into breakout rooms, and we'll have about an hour for the breakout rooms. We'll then come back all together in plenary to share out on some of the reflections that came up in the breakout rooms and conclude with a discussion of next steps. So some ground rules. We ask that folks mute themselves when you're not speaking, and really appreciate your all's participation and suggest minimizing any distractions in the workshop by silencing or turning off your phone. We welcome chat questions to be posted in the chat as we go along. You are also welcome to use the raise hand function in the Zoom menu bar, especially during the periods of Q&A or clarifying questions. And it'd be great if folks are able to identify yourself when speaking or commenting in the chat, which should be accomplished by using the rename function to add your affiliation, just so we can understand what organizations or communities folks are representing. Next slide, please. So this is the last in our series of stakeholder workshops related to this grid services study. We will spend some time toward the end of this workshop discussing what stakeholder participation should look like and actually hearing your input on that. Session slides and recordings of this workshop and the 3 previous ones are available on the MassCEC website at the link that's on the screen. And as always, we welcome any questions or feedback related to the grid services study or specific to this workshop at any of the email addresses listed here. Next slide, please. Excellent. So with that, I'm going to pass it to MassCEC to walk us through the grid services study so far.
Thanks, Brett. And hello, everyone. Lots of familiar names in the participant list. Thanks for joining. I'm Sarah Cullinan. I direct the Net Zero Grid program at MassCEC, Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. MassCEC is the clean energy economic development arm of the Massachusetts state government. We're focused on strengthening and supporting the Massachusetts economy by catalyzing the innovation that is needed to realize our clean, affordable, equitable energy future. My team, the Net Zero Grid team within MassCEC, we focus on fostering innovation specific to the grid for the energy transition. So as we're all hopefully aware, the grid will be our primary platform for decarbonization, and a lot of changes are needed to help get it there. For a successful grid transition, we're going to need lots of new technology, new ways of working, new business models, and new programs and the like to get us there. So as part of my team's work, we see this form of earlier and deeper collaboration with our utilities and other grid-facing stakeholders, such as yourselves, as critical for the grid's transition. And in particular, when we're navigating new, innovative ideas and models like grid services. So this project is one example of that type of work. We've convened this collaborative group of all the kind of icons shown, logos shown on the slide, to convene this study. So all of the partners listed are very much working in close partnership in doing this work on grid services for Massachusetts, and for giving it a roadmap for its continued evolution. My role today is to just give a quick overview of what we've accomplished so far. So what are DERs? We all may be coming from slightly different backgrounds, and even if you're expert in the field of DERs, you'll probably appreciate that DER can have a lot of different meanings. So we want to provide this one as a level setting. So we think of DERs as the technologies connected to our distribution grid. There are several of them. Can include energy efficiency, demand response, solar and storage, and also electrified loads like EVs and heat pumps. For our purposes, I like to think of them as thousands and soon to be millions of interactive nodes on the grid with the capability of pulling, pushing, or modulating electricity onto the grid. One of my colleagues yesterday aptly called them gizmos. So if that resonates, you can also think of DERs as lots of gizmos out there on the grid. Next slide. All right, so DERs can perform a variety of valuable functions, including grid services. So what do we mean by grid services? It can mean something different in other contexts. So we want to ground us in what we're referring to here. So DERs can support and supplement certain distribution grid functions. They can generate and reduce loads like solar. They can also shift like batteries and demand response. By doing those things, DERs can reduce the cost of building and operating the grid by taking some strain off of it. And by doing that, that can defer or even avoid certain infrastructure costs. The objective is that by using the flexibility of DERs, it can save ratepayers money. But DERs also have other benefits that might not have any clear monetary ratepayer cost savings, but they can still be very real societal benefits. We'll also consider those types of benefits in our work here. We call those non-rate impacts. It's also important to note that we're focused specifically on the distribution system side of things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the following slides. All right, so distribution grid services refer to a set of very location-specific needs on the grid. This graphic hopefully helps to visualize what we mean by location-specific. So each step of the way from when electricity is generated, which is shown all the way on the left there, to when it meets load all the way on the right, the system gets more and more fragmented or segmented. You can see, based on the numbers on the slide, that the number of customers served by each piece of equipment decreases as you step down into the system. So DERs are interconnected or located on lots of different places along the distribution grid, and where they are determines what substations or other equipment that they can benefit by their flexibility. In the picture here, for instance, to help reduce strain on that transformer that has the scary red exclamation points all around it, you need DERs on the households that are specifically downstream of that specific asset, that specific transformer. The ones on a different arm of the grid won't help that transformer. So it all goes to say we care very much about specific locations and timing when it comes to grid services from DERs. It also means that the timing and needs differ across different areas of the grid. All right, next slide. So our driving questions for this study, we're looking at the benefits that DERs can provide to the distribution grid, how DERs providing grid services contribute to a more equitable energy system, how to quantify benefits, the location-specific values of DER grid services, including how they differ for EJ populations, what utilities need to do to realize those benefits, and also how to compensate for those benefits. All right. In order to answer all those questions, we have a slate of deliverables that this project team is working on for this study. In terms of valuation, we covered our valuation methodologies in the first workshop, or maybe it was the second workshop, which was recorded on with the record. The recording of that is on our website. The deliverable will take the form of a public spreadsheet model. For compensation, we're thinking about what we mean by compensation is how, by what structures we pay for DERs to provide those services. what do those offerings look like? That was the focus of workshop 3. So while the EDCs will be the ones that actually roll out the specific compensation offerings, we're working in this forum to build up the key considerations for those mechanisms. And then finally, in terms of implementation, which is the focus of today's session, there'll be both a near-term and long-term implementation roadmap or plan intended to convey both how we get pilots or programs off the ground and also how we expect them to evolve and expand into the future. All right. In terms of valuation, there are 3 types that we assessed for the study. The first listed here, deferral value, refers to the benefit that comes from deferring or delaying the need to make an infrastructure investment because DERs are able to fill the need instead. The most traditional aspect of that valuation is measured in the time value of money. So it's better to keep dollars in ratepayers' pockets for longer. A second aspect of that valuation is optionality value. The optionality value reflects the fact that by delaying an investment, you get to wait and see how the electric system's needs develop before committing to an investment. And there's value in that. The second bucket, bridge to wires, refers to situations where there's an immediate infrastructure need that can't be met fast enough with traditional methods. In that case, so for example, the utility might need to rent and run a diesel generator or purchase mobile storage, utility scale storage, to reduce strain on the equipment to prevent an outage in an interim period before they can build out the infrastructure. Then the value of the DERs that could respond instead would be estimated by the costs of the generator or the storage that they're supplementing. The final umbrella value we're including is about recognizing and trying to reduce harms for environmental justice populations and communities. This includes valuing reliability and preventing outages, and also improvements in air quality. All right, so valuation, why is it important? It provides something of a North Star for determining how to compensate grid services from DERs. Ultimately, it is electric ratepayers who end up paying for grid services incentives, and it's also ratepayers who benefit from the different types of savings or grid services that were just described. So we want to use that value as the starting point or the guidepost for setting a maximum incentive level. That helps to ensure that any grid services program or offering ultimately puts downward pressure on rates. So next slide. The core reason for having a grid services offering is to provide value to the electric grid and to ratepayers, and to help support the participants or the DERs for providing that value. If you're looking at it from the perspective of a utility planner, this means trying to meet some specific need that exists on the distribution system using DERs instead. It's possible that a single offering, like a single ask of a DER or a set of DERs, might meet a grid need all on its own. But it could also be, and it might actually be a better option in some cases, that a program or an offering that solicits a whole set of different DERs that can be managed to work together can meet that need. You can see this in the diagram. It's kind of stacked up. Those offerings can stack up to meet that need. Offerings A, B, and C that are shown. So when you're combining multiple offerings, you can shape the offerings to appeal to different customers, different customer classes, different types of DERs. From a potential participant's perspective, a residential customer might be able to respond to offering A, for example. Their neighbor might use offering B. Maybe they have different types of DERs at their disposal. while offering C might work best for a commercial customer with flexible front-of-the-meter DERs. So for instance, whether you have a smart thermostat, an EV, a battery, you might be eligible or able to participate in different or multiple of those offerings. All right. I want to finally, before I conclude, touch briefly on the timeline of the grid services study so far and how engagement and feedback has occurred throughout. The study in our collaboration with our project partners officially kicked off in the fall of 2024. Built into the study were multiple channels for stakeholder engagement. Those channels included 4 public workshops, December, March, April, and today, 3 EJ focus groups in April, and written feedback received throughout. Highlighted in orange, we're currently all part of that 4th and final workshop. After this workshop, there's an opportunity to contribute written feedback as well. The study will conclude this summer with deliverables released in August. Included in these deliverables will be a feedback tracker that shares the feedback we received throughout the study. What happens after the study concludes? At that phase, our role kind of as a project team and Mass CEC convening that project team will end, and that'll be the end of the grid services study. But the work on grid services and implementing the frameworks and recommendations and roadmap, all of those will guide the utilities and all other stakeholders on the future of grid services in Massachusetts over the next multiple years. The utilities will start to pilot grid services offerings in their specific specific areas on their systems. Many of those are already planned and included in the ESMPs. There'll be additional DPU proceedings about the ESMPs and the biannual filings, and those will help to track those pilot offerings and developments. And then along the way, the learnings and iterations will continue to help shape those offerings as they mature and develop. We anticipate that Mass CEC will continue to support specific grid services initiatives and scopes of work in the future, but those all remain to be determined. All right, off to the E3 team.
Thanks, Sarah. So for the last few workshops, as Sarah summarized, we've focused content, especially on valuation and compensation. As was hinted at, we're now kind of moving more towards the implementation stage, though, of course, those prior components are still very important, and we will plan to include all of them discussed in the roadmap that we'll be releasing, again, as Sarah mentioned, in August. So for this final workshop, it's all about implementing a program and how everything's going to come together. That will largely be the role of the EDCs over the next 5 years and then beyond. But we want to really get a kind of sense of all the considerations that need to go into that and put a roadmap in place, basically a guiding document for all of those next steps. So today we're going to refresh on the larger picture beyond this study, key policy considerations and vision for grid services. And then we're going to talk about how to achieve that vision, both our near-term objectives and enabling actions as the EDCs roll out trials or pilot different programs over the next 3 to 5 years, and then recommendations for building offerings and processes to last in the longer term. Before I get into all this, I know Brett mentioned this earlier, just please hold your questions or put them in the chat so you don't forget them. We will have time for clarifying questions at the end of this section with the larger group before we go into breakouts. Okay, so what we're wrapping up over the next few months is just the initial study phase. Somebody mute, please. I think getting a little bit of echo. Okay, thanks. It's just the initial study phase of a longer term effort. Within this phase, we've walked through evaluation methodology for a range of different circumstances. Sarah mentions the bridge to wires, the deferral scenarios, and All these instances where utilities can save ratepayers money by delaying investments or reduce costs and impacts in situations where you have updated infrastructure that's needed, but it can't be built fast enough. We also spent much of the last 2 workshops discussing compensation design and have tried to weave equity considerations throughout this, discussing ways to value and provide heightened compensation for environmental justice populations, and just as importantly, ensuring that there are benefits going to non-participants as well to support energy affordability for everyone. The remainder of this study phase, that is today and throughout the summer, we'll be talking about and building a roadmap for implementation of grid services offerings. Sarah's already mentioned this. I'm going to walk through the timeline again briefly on the next slide just to put some dates on it, but I think this is solidly what we've covered. And really this sets us up to pass the baton on to the EDCs who are already have begun the larger undertaking of designing and setting up grid services offerings. So corresponding to our study topics, this involves actually taking and applying real-world inputs to the valuation at specific locations on the grid and determining appropriate compensation levels and structures to go along with those. Guided as well by the structures and input from this study and all of the input you've provided and are providing, as well as sort of on-the-job learnings they make as they roll things out throughout the next 3 to 5 years, especially. So this feeds into designing and developing specific offerings with further considerations such as how the EDCs are going to approach and offer incentives, do marketing and outreach, and how DERs will actually be dispatched. There's a lot of different things going into it. And finally, there's the actual implementation of all of this. So as you can see in the graphic, the EDC-led phase isn't going to be just a simple waterfall of steps one after the other. It's really an iterative and evolving process, making sure that things work, improving upon them where they don't, and gradually expanding the programs. For this evolution, an important through line on the left here you can see in dragging across will be the need for stakeholder input. So that's on all of you, especially. While there might not be additional workshops or a forum like this in the design and implementation phase, the EDCs will continue to request and appreciate input from participants in the community. And in terms of how that gets provided, that's actually a topic we'll want to hear more about from you on in the breakout rooms later. No, got a little bit to get through before then. We do want to understand the best way to continue receiving and incorporating your feedback. So bringing us back to a timeline, this is kind of if you zoom out from the slide a few minutes ago that Sarah presented, all of the study timeline there fits into that first, again, orange for today, sort of bullet or box at the top. Even as we're wrapping up this study, the DPU will be issuing a ruling on the utility ESMPs, I believe in June or by the end of June. And the first test offerings from National Grid initially will start to be rolled out in the summer. Additional test offerings in limited locations will be rolled out by the EDCs over the next couple of years, and then scale for the next 4 to 5. During this time, the EDCs will provide updates and offer formal opportunities for comments through their biannual ESMP reports, which will cover the grid services offerings among a range of other topics. We view these next 5 years as the near-term rollout. So when we're talking near-term and long-term, that's the time frame we're talking about, which will be capped by a public filing in 2029, where the EDCs will submit updated detailed plans to the DPU. This will be another moment to assess how things have gone and reorient to whatever is next, looking to the longer-term future of grid services for 2030 and beyond. So coming back to the present, or at least partially, I want to revisit some of our general policy goals that we've applied to the study and discussed throughout the workshops. So for those of you that have been able to attend the prior workshops, this Venn diagram here may be pretty familiar by now, and I just want to tilt it towards the lens of broader implementation. Like many utility programs and offerings, we want any eventual grid services offerings to strike a balance between encouraging program participation to get things up and running, managing cost shifts, and in this case, specifically improving affordability for ratepayers, and realizing the maximum potential value both for the grid and communities all around. We've applied these to the valuation and compensation design, and when tying into the implementation, we can consider additional elements such as the impact of education and outreach on participation, the importance of clear and consistent processes to apply to valuing and setting compensation, and how the EDCs will actually incorporate DERs in their planning and operations. So that's kind of realizing the value in the end. These policy goals align overall with resolving several of the challenges that have been noted in the DPU's 2024 ES&P order and with prior grid modernization group recommendations, as well as the less explicit, but of course very relevant goal of affordability throughout. So I'm going to bring back yet another slide, this time from workshop 3. We can split those policy goals into a series of criteria for evaluating offerings as we go. Again, the same items that apply to compensation mechanisms should largely apply to implementation overall. We want to stay consistent here. So we've slightly reordered these to put ratepayer savings at the top based on the feedback that you all shared during workshop 3 regarding prioritization. You might also notice that the supporting implementation steps are just slightly different than those we discussed for compensation, simply because looking at implementation more broadly gives us a wider range of tools with which we must address the different criteria. We still want to ensure that benefits of an offering provided exceed costs to promote ratepayer savings, but we also want to be factoring in, for example, the total costs, including things like studies and the administration of programs rather than just looking at the incentives provided, and factoring in the real world implementation costs. While we're talking about criteria here, since most of this was presented in the prior workshop, I'm not going to walk through everything, but I do want to highlight that as we discussed and heard from stakeholders last time around, one of the biggest equity concerns is energy affordability overall. So even with the tools that go beyond purely compensation, we want to acknowledge there are barriers to entry in owning DERs that a grid services offering alone won't be able to fully resolve. We want to set things up to reduce those barriers, but at an even more basic level, we want to make sure that any offerings are helping to combat the crisis of affordability rather than contributing into it. So this just digs into another reason that ratepayer savings has kind of moved to the top of that list, since it helps underpin other elements such as equity as well. So with those criteria and considerations in mind, or refreshed on them anyways, we next want to talk about the big picture vision for grid services. So if there's a theme here, it's coming back to what we've brought up previously, but I want to bring back the slide from workshop 1 from the EDC's presentation in that meeting about their vision for capturing the potential value of grid services. So as described on this slide, this future vision involves integrating customer resources and flexibility into local grid planning and operations, and using those to reduce costs of a clean energy transition. So to refresh here on the terms or align, the customer flexibility is technology agnostic in this case, and could include active management of flexible demand. So managing EV charging or thermostat use, exporting DERs, like solar storage, or demand reduction, including energy efficiency. Basically, there's just a variety of different things that go into this, and it's anything that allows us to play around or be flexible with what the demand is on the system. So this full integration of customer flexibility and local operations is a future vision, and we are still in the early stages. To move us towards that vision, we're talking about and taking a walk before you run approach. So the EDCs are pursuing a set of near-term actions and objectives as they test out initial grid service offerings and learn what's going to work best in the long term. So this study to date and the implementation plan are intended to provide the EDCs and the state with a set of recommendations, both for approaching those early steps and transitioning towards the future. Before we move into the near-term objectives and those earliest steps, I do want to spend a little bit more time on the vision, just to break out and highlight a few core pieces on the potential for grid services. So ultimately, we see grid services offerings as another tool in the tool belt, a Swiss Army knife even, to support utilities in building a cleaner and more affordable grid. There's a lot of different things that it can be used for and help with. Once everything's fully ramped up, DERs that participate in grid services offerings can be used as tailored solutions to address highly localized needs, which may occur at specific times and on specific locations in the grid. This functionality can be incorporated into planning to optimize investments, using sort of that Swiss Army knife instead of a bandsaw to shave off pieces and make things right-sized. And also in ongoing operations, calling on DERs to dispatch when there are unexpected or relatively sudden strains on the distribution system. All of this can help lower costs for everyone and also allow us to accelerate electrification and cleaning the grid, which might otherwise be held up waiting for longer lead time infrastructure. Alternative solutions might exist in some cases. The DERs can give us a way to avoid, say, rolling out a diesel generator for the backup and dealing with all of the noise and environmental impacts that creates, and reducing costs as well. Finally, recognizing that there are many historic inequities built into our energy systems, we want any grid services offerings to help alleviate those burdens and to also provide additional support for environmental justice participation populations to participate directly and have ownership of DERs where possible. Fully addressing these needs is going to require a whole bunch of different parallel efforts, but we see grid services as at least one way to nudge us in a better direction. So, onto the near-term, slightly more concrete steps. So moving from the grid of today, here in the bottom right here, towards our longer-term vision for grid services, starts with actionable objectives. As we conclude this study, I mentioned that the EDCs will begin to test out grid services offerings in specific locations. So National Grid is primed, and we're going to hear from them in a couple of minutes, to start on this within the next month or two even. And the other EDCs will have more programs to gradually follow that. These offerings may be intentionally differentiated between utilities or in different locations just to explore different options early on, to gather information and to see what works best before scaling everything up. These trial runs will also be informed to some degree by the results of this study and the input you provide, including around key objectives. We don't want to set expectations that everything is going to materialize immediately, but we do want to know what considerations are important to you so that the EDCs can get started off on the right foot. The core near-term objectives that we're considering at the moment are shown here, and really prioritize the information gathering aspect, while also, of course, working to start realizing some of the benefits that we've discussed. We, and I'm using the term we pretty generally for much of the day, as a lot of this will largely be through the efforts of the EDCs and collaboration across the state. But we, in that sense, will want to test and refine offerings and identify the data and processes needed to take advantage of grid services. We want to understand both what capabilities and needs are out there today for DERs. We also want to know what sort of response we can expect and eventually rely on for these programs. And of course, we want to make sure that these offerings, I should say, are actually able to provide ratepayer savings and mitigate system risks. So you might notice a common pattern as we go through where we're laying down the high-level goals and then breaking them down into more specifics, moving down a funnel. In this case, the near-term objectives, shown on the left, will be supported by a mix of different individual actions. These aren't a one-to-one mapping. The other actions will be required, and some of these actions listed will address multiple objectives, two birds with one stone, where we can. So one of the first steps will be for EDCs to identify high-need areas of the system where DERs can provide the most benefit, and then determine what that benefit is. Goes into the valuation piece, but also picking the where and the when. We'll also need to update that valuation over time as the system and our understanding of it evolves, and try to fill in the gaps with data to help that understanding. So translate into developing compensation mechanisms, incorporating input and study findings, as we've discussed before. And we'll want to develop transparent processes to receive and act on stakeholder feedback, and also create channels for outreach to keep everyone involved. All of this is still somewhat general. So while we're going to be making these recommendations in the study and the roadmap, it will be the EDCs actually putting these into action. So to give an example of what this will look like in practice, at least for some of the first trial offerings, I do want to pass the mic over to National Grid for a few minutes.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. So as Andrew said, and as the title of the slide conveys, National Grid is planning to test grid service offerings this very summer of 2025. Now, this is conditional, I think, as Andrew said earlier, on a ruling by the DPU. Specifically, it's phase 2 order on the EDC's electric sector modernization plans, the ESMPs, which is expected, that order is expected sometime this month during June. So if we receive approval via that order of the Grid Services Compensation Fund, National Grid will be plans to roll out local grid service offerings in 5 locations, as you can see on the slide. And if you look it down in the table on the lower left there, you can see what those 5 planned locations are. Now, we will be testing 2 separate approaches. And this is where Andrew was talking about implementation. This is where we are testing 2 approaches to implementing grid services offerings. The first is what we're calling a locational bonus incentive approach. I know that's a bit of a mouthful. What that means is, in those locations, we will provide bonus incentives to customers and aggregators who participate that are stacked on top of existing programs. So one maybe easy to grasp example of this is that for our existing demand response programs, which are branded as Connected Solutions, we'll be offering a Connected Solutions Plus in those particular areas. So again, bonus incentives stacked on top of existing program incentives. The other approach, the second approach, is what might be termed a market-based approach. This is where National Grid solicits bids via a marketplace platform from aggregators, also sometimes called flexibility service providers or FSPs, and solicit those bids via via competitions on a platform. The assets for each approach are a little bit different. This has to do, I won't go into details as to why, but has to do with existing program structures and the capabilities of the platform. For more information, for those of you who may be FSPs or aggregators who are interested in learning a little bit more about either approach, but particularly the market-based approach, there are some links here on this slide, which I will repost in the chat at the very end of the call, so as not to disturb the chat, but I will post those towards the end of the call. But as you can see at the bottom of the slide, it gives you a better sense of the timeline, right? These 2 approaches, we'll be trialing them this summer, 2025, in that box circled or squared in the red, and then evolving and expanding over time, as Andrew said. And with that, Andrew, I think I'll pass it back to you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Gideon. So I'm guessing there's going to be some questions for National Grid and in general coming out of this. But before we get to those, I do want to just move through quickly and discuss kind of what comes after the immediate next steps, like the offerings Gideon described. So ultimately, we want to be setting ourselves up for long-term success. And in the roadmap, what we intend to do, and that's the report we're writing over the next few months, is provide recommendations on how grid services offerings can adapt and self-correct to meet our policy goals, not just during, but beyond the next 5 years. We'll split the questions we want to ask out and address into the 3 familiar categories: evaluation, compensation, and implementation, just for familiarity. But in terms of valuation, we want to touch on how we should react to changes in value over time. Different areas of the grid will come under strain or be relieved as the grid grows and develops, and technologies evolve to support it. And we want to be reacting to that and set a cadence for reevaluating benefits that DERs can provide so that the programs can grow as well for time. As technologies and data availability evolves, we also want to continue exploring what other benefits we could be taking advantage of from DERs on the system and how to quantify these properly or compensate them. You want to emphasize that this is still focused on the distribution grid and the same sort of category of grid services that we've been discussing throughout this. And crucially, we also want to be measuring our progress and ensuring that all of this is creating savings net of the compensation that goes out to DERs and any program costs, making sure that there isn't an unfair burden created by any of this. In terms of compensation, which will be closely linked, we want to have a plan in place to ask whether the mechanisms that are set up are working as intended and giving signals that participants can react to and provide value in the right locations or at the right times. So as those structures then are meeting the grid's needs effectively, We want to also make sure that we're meeting participant needs and ask what more can be done to drive participation and facilitate deployment, and provide some recommendations moving forward for that. Though, again, all of this will continue to evolve. We just want to get us on the right place and have a long-term plan in. And specific to any environmental justice adders to be factored in, which we discussed, especially in, I believe, the last workshop, we want to make sure that the value for that sort of adder is getting to the community members it's actually intended for, and at least improving the ability of EJ populations to participate. And finally, implementation is really overarching, but we want to ask and provide recommendations for how we can monitor for success of the program and overall, all of those different items I just talked about, how we can make sure there's enough accessible educational material out there to explain to customers what the benefits of grid services are, how they may be able to participate. And last but not least is the question of, over the long term, how can we make sure any offerings and processes are there to help build trust with communities and support them? We can't do any of this without the support of the community, and we want to recognize that there have been reasons that there's distrust that exists, and we need to overcome that and find ways to better reach out and support everyone that the grid is supposed to be supporting. So with all of this, the roadmap itself that we're talking about won't solve all of these challenges. We can't do that with a piece of paper or a report. But what we can do and want to do is lay out a plan for doing so in the long term, or at least highlight the areas where we still have questions and where there's more work to be done. So as we're moving into the breakouts, what we want is to get all of your input onto this, so you can help us to understand what we're missing and what we need to prioritize. So that's really the biggest focus of these breakout rooms. And we'll also, as Sarah had mentioned at the beginning, have opportunities for written feedback following this once you've had more time to think about it. But with that, I'm going to open it up to questions for the large group for the next 10 or so minutes. I think we're right on time with my, if I have the timing right. And then we'll have some time to move into the breakouts after a short break. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or throw them in the chat. If there are already questions in the chat, I might ask if anybody's able to help me address those or call those out, as they might not be able to see them directly.
No questions yet in the chat, Andrew. So I think if folks, yeah, feel free to drop them in the chat, as Andrew said, or raise your hand and come off mute.
Okay, and if we don't have questions, I'll give it another minute or two if anybody comes up with any just to think, but we can also move on to the poll and break a little bit early as well, and can save questions for the very end of the presentation if there are any. But give it another minute or two first. Okay, well, I don't want to prevent anybody from asking questions, so feel free to follow up later, but don't want to waste anybody's time either as we're here. So we're going to move out next to the breakout rooms, and I'll pass it back to you, Brett, I guess, if you want to just walk through the topics and the structure before we do the poll.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so we're about to take a short break, but we would love to do a poll before we go to that break. And I'll just preview the breakout rooms a bit before we open up the poll and say that the various topics that Andrew just covered in his presentation are the areas where we will be soliciting your input and feedback. So we'll have some space in each of the breakout rooms for reflections on the proposed long-term vision and the various objectives, the near-term objectives, and then the roadmap product or deliverable that will be produced as part of the grid services study that Andrew mentioned. And then lastly, we'd love to solicit some input from you all on your preferences regarding opportunities for stakeholder input and feedback throughout this next implementation phase. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So we'll have about 60 minutes for the breakout rooms, and then we'll come back into the plenary Zoom session to have a bit of a share out. We will have two breakout rooms sort of focused on the various types of offerings that Sarah described and then Andrew referenced. So breakout room one, and this is the same structure that we used in the last workshop if you attended that one. Breakout room one will focus on sort of residential offerings. And breakout room two will focus on commercial or front of the meter or larger scale DER developments and offerings that relate to those sectors. You can attend whichever breakout session you feel better aligns with your expertise or the area that you'd like to contribute. The breakouts will cover the same material, so it will just be sort of trying to cluster the perspectives along these dimensions. And then we will come back and have a share out so you'll get a recap of what was said in the other breakout room. If we have too many folks, we may adjust the numbers and open up a third room and then move people around a bit, but we'll try to keep each room focused on this sort of residential perspective and then the commercial and front of the meter type perspective. Great. So we will open a poll in just a moment, and we're going to ask that if you are part of the larger project team, or if you are not planning to stay for the breakout rooms, please don't answer the poll. But if you would like to join us for the breakout rooms, and we would be highly appreciative of your input there, go ahead and fill out the poll, and that will help us just organize how many rooms we end up opening up. So I think with that, go ahead and open up the poll. Thank you, Georgia. So please, yeah, put your responses here. Excellent. And I see one or two folks that just joined. We're about to transition into breakout rooms. If you could, hopefully you're seeing the poll, if you could answer the poll and say sort of what perspective or lens you'd like to contribute to in the breakout room. And then as soon as, yeah, I see a question in the chat, we are going to take a 10-minute break. So as soon as you've filled out the poll, feel free to start a break, and we're going to take 10 minutes and reconvene at 2:10 Eastern Time. So once you've given your response to the poll, feel free to start that break, and then we'll see you back here at 2:10, and that's when we'll open up the breakout rooms. Okay. Great. It looks like the poll responses have trickled down, so we'll see everyone at 2:10. Thanks all. Or other devices. Great. So we will open the breakout rooms in just a moment. Thanks very much for filling out the poll ahead of time. As a result of the poll, it looks like we'll just have two rooms, one focused on the residential offerings and others focused on commercial in front of the meter offerings. It may be that we need a minute to reshuffle folks, especially if there's folks who are calling in. You may not be able to join the breakout rooms, but we have a plan to use the plenary space as one of the breakout rooms if need be. The breakouts are designed to gather your feedback and input on the various topics that I described before the break. Each breakout room will have a facilitator and a note taker from the Mass CEC, E3, and RMI team. The facilitator will guide the discussion through a series of activities, and there will be a shared workspace to help us capture your ideas and input. Your facilitator will share the link to that workspace once you are in the breakout room. And if you're unable to access it, the facilitator will also share their screen so that you can follow along and provide verbal input. We will reconvene in 60 minutes and then get a brief share out from each of the breakout rooms that the note takers will provide. And so I think that's it. So what will happen next is we will open up the breakout rooms, and you should see it pop up on your screen, and you'll need to self-select into the breakout room that you said you would like to join in the poll, or if you didn't participate in the poll, select the one that that you would like to join and contribute to. If for some reason you don't see the pop out, there is a breakout room button on your Zoom bar. And so once the rooms are open, you should be able to click that and see them there as well. Great. So thanks, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you all in 60 minutes.
This is the final workshop. Oh, sorry. This is the final workshop of the 4. Thanks to everybody that's been along for the whole ride, and even those who've joined partway through. We really appreciate it. And even if you're watching this later on at some future date, just your participation and willingness to engage we're very grateful for it. We will have the slides posted after this, both for this session and all prior sessions already are there on the Mass CEC Grid Services website. And I believe Brett popped it in the chat way at the beginning of this as well. So this site's the home for these slides, recordings, general information about the study, as well as a primer that we put together back during one of the early workshops for the series as well. If you've followed along a little bit and had some terms that we mentioned and you're not familiar with, that's totally fine. There's a lot of information flowing at you. We're hoping that that primer and some of the other content we've provided can help fill you in there. I mentioned this is the last workshop, but please also still stay tuned throughout this summer. At the end of August, we're going to be, or mid-August, we'll be releasing our final roadmap report that we've discussed to some degree today, as well as an accompanying spreadsheet model that Sarah referenced as well. That's a grid services valuation model. And so it's more of an illustration of how some of the valuation would be done. Please, if you have any other feedback that you haven't been able to provide today or previously, don't hesitate to share it with us. We have a few different emails here you can send it to, any or all of the above. And we will also have some forms available, I believe, on the website for that feedback. We can also follow up with one-on-one meetings or really any other avenues that you're open to share feedback with us, we're eager to get it. So appreciate that. And that's really it for today and for this series. We really appreciate your time and can stay on for a few more minutes. We'll end the recording now. If you have questions or comments or anything you didn't want to be recorded specifically, that's fine as well. But otherwise, appreciate it and hope you have a good rest of your afternoons.
Thanks, everyone.